and do every day. So I am excited to be here, excited to kind of give sort of the historic and archaeological background to this work. And I really am interested to hear what you all have to say and what was surprising for you, and questions and all of that kind of stuff. I do best when people ask lots of questions. So sort of for later, I encourage that.
That's great. Thank you. Wendy, can I turn it back to you? I muted you, but I'll unmute you. Let me see. I know Wendy always has a really nice preamble in these, and I want to give her the chance to talk a little bit. Hopefully she'll.
Hi there. Hopefully you can hear me now. Yes. Welcome everybody. Yeah, as Carolyn said, I also had read this book years ago and was really intrigued by it for a number of reasons. And in fact, I am in Virginia working alongside Mary this week at Montpelier. So when I read the book, it brought so many things to my mind. But as I'm going to start with the normal format, we talk a little bit about the author first. The author is from Toronto, or from Canada, and she and her husband moved to rural Virginia, and they started research history of their own house. They have an old home, and they were looking at the history of the land that surrounded it, and they discovered an old map that had their house on it, but there was also another place on the map that said Negro Hill. And that's what really intrigued her. She tried to find more information about it, but no one could really give her any information. They just always figured that something bad had happened there. And so that really started capturing her imagination of what was happening, and that's how she started doing research and coming up with this book. Now, the book is not about her property, but that's what spurred her on. She is from Saskatchewan originally. Mary, just so you know, the house that they were looking at was an 1830 home, and so that kind of gives you an idea of the era that her house is. But we typically start out with a couple of standard questions that we use. And the first one is, what passage in the book intrigued you, or what was a favorite part? And I'll start with mine, and then I'll open it up to other people who might want to share some parts that they liked and why. Let me just find my part of the book. Bear with me. Mine comes fairly early in the book, and it's when, hold on, well, if I can find it, sorry. Bear with me 1 second. You can see me it's good you can't see me frantically looking through my book. It's when Lavinia is talking, and she's a very young girl. She's just come, and she's sitting in the lap of, I think, Papa, and she says, "Could I be your girl too?" I asked quickly. The large, broad-shouldered man looked away before he answered. "Well, now," he said, as though he'd given it deep thought, "I sure do think I would like that." But she said, concerned that he hadn't noticed, "I don't look like the other girls." "You mean because you're white?" I nodded. "Abina," he said, pointing towards the chickens. "Look at those birds. Some of them be brown, some of them be white and black. Do you think when they little chicks, those mamas and papas care about that?" And that's always been my favorite part of the book, because I think about the innocence of the young child. All she sees is a group of people that love each other, and that to her is family, and she wants to be a part of that. So, anybody else have some favorite parts they want to share?
Well, I can say there was I don't have the book well, I do have the book. I have the Kindle. But it was, I think it was Belle. I'm not 100% sure, but if it was Belle or Lavinia talking to May, and I think it had to do with the craziness after Marshall. I don't know if it was after his sister died or after, or after she was raped. But she went to May, it was either Lavinia, May, very upset about everything. And May's response was along the lines of, today is today. I can only think about today. I can only talk about today. And well, that just really, again, it was just so in line with just everything, what our world is like today too. Today's today, like who knows what next week. But it really just hit me. I mean, she was great. The characters were just so great. Anyway.
Yeah, just sort of that idea that we have to live with what we've got, and just be with it. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts? Somebody else? Overall, what did you think of the book? Peggy, were you about to say something? Or you think I saw you kind of raising your hand? I'm not sure.
Okay. So yeah. So the characters are amazingly rich. I agree. But the part that I was impressed by was after the baby dies, early on in the book, and Lavinia starts to remember what happened on the boat. And Mama is holding her in her lap, and they're just rocking back and forth to sort of calm her down and give her a safe space to remember that stuff. That was powerful for me. And it was just, and as you said, people accepting what you have, but they all seem so wise,
One of the things that the author talks about in terms of what she wants to leave from the book is this idea of family, that family is not necessarily who you're born into, but it's who you're surrounded with. And I think, this, Peggy, what you just talked about with Mama rocking her shows that kind of, that the family becomes who you are with and who cares for you. Yep. Other ideas?
Well, just commenting on that family piece, the fact that I totally agree with what you were saying about their family, and whoever was there was taken care of and in the fold and loved. But that just juxtaposition with the white family and who was accepted and who was, and it was just so different from one, segment to the other. And I think that's one thing through the course of it that really stayed with me, was just the kindness. Someone said wisdom, the depth, the caring, the love, the understanding, all the range of emotions, and how to be there for everyone during that, in the Black lives. I was so touched by that. And I actually didn't read it, but I listened to it, which made it very rich because the reader was so good with the dialect, and it just it really touched me. And so it was very different in the different families is what I started with.
Anybody else have some comments about the white family? I mean, I think you're right. There is a very significant contrast. One of the things, and I think that the author does that purposefully, to continue to show the two different sides. One of the things, though, that I think that it pointed out to me that I had not thought about before was the isolation in the white family. The fact that I always had this impression that balls were going on all the time in the southern plantations, and not this isolated woman by herself. Her husband's gone off. He's off all the time at sea. She really has no one close to her to rely on. And so that isolation that she felt, and then that's compared to the loving kindness that we're seeing happening in the slave community, in the enslaved.
Right.
So it's a real significant contrast.
And the other contrast that we want to point out is over time when Lavinia has to shift from one family to the other family. She has to shift from her black family to her white family. And I think that's kind of a key moment for Lavinia is when she has to make that shift.
And the struggle she goes through to make that shift.
So that was,
Now,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things, though, do you feel, and anybody can answer this, when Lavinia was brought into the white family, do you think she was brought in? She wasn't being brought in as an equal. She was being brought, I mean, why do you think she was being brought in? She was not necessarily as a servant per se, but she was not being brought in as a member of the family or as an equal to their daughter, but more as a companion to the daughter. So you're still seeing that struggle of class as well.
You think she was being brought in as a companion for Belle or Sally?
No,
For
not
Megan.
for Megan.
For Meg.
And not necessarily a friend, but
in Jamestown, when she went to
yes,
Jamestown.
in Jamestown. Yeah.
Okay. Or Williamsburg. I'm sorry, Williamsburg. Yeah. Okay. So I have a question for anybody that might understand the history better. So how authentic was the story? How authentic were the characters? How authentic was the language? I didn't know how much I was reading fiction and how much of it might have been reality.
I will say the language I felt to be very authentic. I've been born and raised in the South, and I understood all of it.
And so how about the relationships and, the relationships and I can imagine that depth of a story was probably reflective of what might have been real in some instances, but how about the relationships as well?
So
I mean, other than the rape, I'm sure that occurred, things like that, but.
I can actually jump in here a little bit with this.
Our historian.
Great. So when I first, read the back cover of this book, I went, oh my gosh, because my dissertation site was in Alexandria, Virginia. And part of my site was adjacent to where a plantation owned by Robert E. Lee's nephew, Cassius, was. And Cassius Lee also owned a house in the city of Alexandria. And this was considered sort of the country house. The plantation was the country house. While he was in the city, he employed an Irish paid domestic servant while also enslaving African-American domestic workers in the same household at the same time. When he moves from the city to the plantation exclusively, he no longer employs any white Irish immigrants or white people at all. He exclusively uses the labor of enslaved people. And one of the things it was really surprising when I started doing the research relating to this particular plantation and these families to see this, because what I sort of figured out and what some other historians had interpreted is that the use of white paid servants was a status symbol for Southerners in urban areas that were in either kind of the borderlands between the North and the South, or where they were regularly interacting with people that did not own slaves. And it to kind of give them a level of status and sort of legitimacy with non-slave owners. So even if they had enslaved people working for them side by side with a paid white servant, that having that paid white servant gave them an extra bit of status. But when they were on just the plantations, they no longer needed that. That was no longer a status symbol that worked for them. So they didn't employ white labor on the plantations for domestic labor in the same way. So sort of the core of the story of having basically an indentured Irish girl alongside an enslaved population is based on things that did happen. I don't know that the author, what she knew or what her historical research was, but certainly those things did happen. They were sort of rare. They were very isolated, where it would be like one indentured or paid white immigrant with a majority of enslaved African American laborers. But and sort of the optics of it, and why in some situations those optics were considered beneficial and why in some situations they weren't. But I think one of the probably the biggest differences is the majority of those immigrant domestic workers didn't stay in those positions very long. So unlike the character in the book who grows up, the woman who was working for Cassius Lee was with him less than 10 years. She was with him for just a few years, because once she got married, she moved in with her husband and started doing her own personal upward mobility into trying to get into the middle class.
She was recounting
For the enslaved women, that wasn't an option for them.
Cast as she moves about.
So that's a little bit of kind of a connection to history and to what was happening in Virginia at sort of a similar time as the book was written, because it would have been pretty contemporaneous in that early part of the 19th century.
Mary, can I ask Mary a question? So you're talking about the indentured white household servants, right? Like Lavinia. But what about like the relationship that the main family in the story in the kitchen house, and just sort of how they were really, it seemed that they were treated much, much better than, they would talk about the slaves that were working in the plantation itself. So was that common?
Yeah, Randy, I think what we're talking about is there are, in most plantations, and Mary can correct me if I'm wrong, you have the domestics, and then you have the field. If you have a large plantation with a number of slaves, you would have the domestic enslaved, and then you'd have the field workers. And those were sort of almost like two different classes of enslaved populations, and they would be treated very differently in terms of.
It's a big misconception in a lot of ways, because, so like, for example, at Montpelier, we have what you could even describe as like three different groups of people. We have the people that would have worked in the fields. We also have the artisans, and then you have the people that would have worked in the house. So the artisans are your blacksmiths, your skilled laborers. So it's even more complicated. I was really surprised reading the book when the sort of one of the storylines was about, in the beginning, about how the overseer was trying to keep Belle from marrying, or keep Dory from marrying whoever, because he didn't want somebody from the house marrying someone in the field. That is not something that, generally speaking, would have happened. There would have been separations and access to certain things. For example, working in a kitchen would have provided you better access to food that maybe working in the field quarters wouldn't. But generally on a plantation, everyone is related, and everyone is works as a more, there are more similarities, particularly on Virginia plantations, between the what the people have that are domestic workers and the field workers. So they have the same dishes, they have similar clothing, like their material culture, their trash looks very, very, very similar. Their things look very, very similar. Their relationships are very intertwined. So it's just a whole lot messier than what was portrayed in this book, meaning there's not these very distinguished categories often in the same way. Because another example would be, for example, at Montpelier, one of the enslaved people that is talked about quite a bit is a guy named Sawney. And Sawney would not have worked in the main house in the later part of his life because he would have been out on a tract of land quite far from the main house, actually working as an overseer over other enslaved people working in the fields. So he was in the fields doing work, but he was also kind of one of the most trusted and relied upon individuals, although as opposed to Paul Jennings, who was James Madison's personal manservant. So was with him in the house every day, with him in the White House in Washington, D.C. Both of those men were very trusted in different ways by the Madisons and would have considered maybe having more status among the community, but they both have very, very different jobs. So I think it is just a little bit more complicated than often we think about or is presented, particularly in popular culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the book sort of continues to reinforce that the basic, very simplistic way of looking at it, as opposed to how complex it typically was. No. Okay. One of the things, let's get into a couple of the other questions. Let's see. Why do you think that this author chose to tell the story between two different narrators? It was told through Belle and it was told through Lavinia. And what kind of observations and judgments were made from the two different sides?
Well, it certainly made the story more interesting to have both perspectives. I think it would have been kind of a narrow story. It's more about Lavinia, I think, but it would have been too narrow if we had just seen her perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Anybody else?
Now, in both of them, in terms of both Lavinia and Belle make poor choices. Both of them make some good choices. Another character that I think is kind of interesting that's very complicated and very complex in the book is Marshall. At times he's kind of, yeah, well, he's awful, but at times he's kind and protective, very few times, but and then other times he's a violent monster. And so, first of all, do you think he's to blame what happened to his sister?
He clearly had an anger management problem.
Yes.
Yeah,
It was damaged,
Yes,
though.
but he was being
He was being goaded.
Manipulated by Rankin and by his tutor. Yeah.
by the tutor. I mean, and he had anger. Yes, of course he had anger issues. How old was he? 12? I mean, you know, I'd have anger issues too. And he didn't know what to do with them. And so my feeling is that he pushed his sister so the tutor would never get to her.
Whoa. I never thought of that. But he was abused. He was neglected. He was not parented. He was.
I think he might have had some mental issues too.
Yeah.
Like
He was just
mental illness like his mother.
He's a product of his father. That's part of that generational too. It just depends on the plantation you were on, but yeah.
And his absent father, who was hardly ever there.
Yeah, and he learned that, exactly.
And then the overseer just stepped in and took the role of father and
And he
directed
was
his thinking and shaped his morals.
Mm-hmm.
Misshaped.
Okay, agreed.
Okay, what about the relationship between Ben's wife Lucy and Belle,
Interesting.
and how that relationship changes throughout the book?
Yeah. I thought it was an amazing relationship, really. I mean, and I've read about, actually, I've been reading State of Wonder, just as an aside for anybody who, so it seems like, you know, for other cultures, maybe that idea of passing your child off to someone else is not that foreign, you know? It just, it was, that was the most striking part about it to me. And I guess just a mutual love and respect that they were all in it together. And I think they recognized that it was about survival. And I think Lucy felt a great deal of compassion for Belle for having lost her son in the way that she did. You know, it was.
I didn't have a problem with the sharing of the children because that was very cultural. I guess the thing that surprised me was the sharing of the husband.
What the heck? Yes.
What man is going to say no?
Yeah.
I was really kind of touched by that relationship that the three of them and the family had, because again, they were in such extreme situations and there were no really options there. You know, Belle couldn't marry who she wanted to, and Ben, you know, loved her, but just through circumstances and as time passed, connected with Lucy, and he cared for both of them. They cared for each other. They were all in these situations that were just unbelievable, but they could find the love and care and, you know, support. And so, yeah, I don't think it's what they originally would have hoped for, but again, they made the best of what they had, which is what the people seem to do throughout the book. And they just had an amazing amount of just, I don't know, just the ability to work with what they had and make the best.
You know, speaking of working with what they have and making the best, another part that really struck me was the boiling of the plank boards from the smokehouse to get the salt. And that really struck me hard, you know, that they were stooping to that level of being able to survive. And so I thought that was very telling in a way. One of the comments
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Well, the whole scene when they go to see the other slaves and the mother serves the food in a pig trough, you know, and the kids are just eating from the pig trough. I'm like, oh my God, you know, and yet they thought it was perfectly fine, you know, everybody's getting fed, so what's the problem, you know? And it was such a visual.
Yep, very much so. Yeah, I mean, there were parts of the book that were very rough to read.
Yes.
At least to me, they were, you know, very rough. One of the things that Lavinia said was, I was as enslaved as all the others. And do you think that statement's true? And how is her position equivalent to that of the slaves? And what freedoms does she have that they do not have?
I think part of that is because Lavinia did not understand her indenturedness. She had lost her family, and so she had no clue until she was 17 that she was just indentured.
Mm-hmm.
But But I do think there is a vast difference between indentured and enslaved.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think it speaks to the powerlessness of women in that time, that they were so dependent on men, that their children weren't their children, if you know, that they couldn't keep them, whether they were Lavinia or whether it was Belle. They couldn't keep their children. They didn't have a way to support themselves. They couldn't own land. I mean, it just seemed like they were so powerless, and she ended up with, you know, a husband who drank too much and beat her, and there was really no way out of there. I mean, I felt like she was stuck, just like the, you know, like the slaves were. And
She just dressed nicer.
I think that's one of the ongoing themes of the book is women's place in society during that time. But my family came to America as indentured servants in the 1700s. And so I was thinking about that a little bit. But other thought I had was the nature of women's place in society and how they had the three different categories or caste system that we were looking at in the book, from slavery to indentured servants to a white woman in somewhat in privilege. But the thing that makes it so different to me, and I think it's because of I'm from Charleston, and you know the history of slavery here. This is where most slaves were brought into America, was our port of Charleston. Is that I don't think I felt the sense of, in the book, of you will be sold as a slave, that overwhelming sense of you were absolutely not free, whereas indentured servant, you knew you would be free after a certain amount of time. So it's, to me, very different, and it wasn't as made as ominous in the book as I think the reality of the time was.
But I don't think that Lavinia had any idea that she was any different from her Black friends until the point when she married Marshall. And then all of a sudden, life changed. Yeah.
Well, it definitely. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I thought I came in and went out, so that's okay, Randy. Go on.
No, I was going to say, I mean, you know, I don't think that Lavinia didn't really relate to herself as being white and or different from her slave family. I mean, she, growing up, she saw herself as the same, even though she was confused as to why people looked at her or treated her differently. But she was always different from the beginning of the story. I mean, she had that chance to, although it was perplexing because Lavinia had that chance to, could have walked away in a way. Belle could have walked away. Belle had her papers. Yep. Belle chose to stay. So that to me also was, you know, there was sort of something about the two of them as well, where, you know, Lavinia, I mean, you know, at the end of the story, she's still there, right? But of course, she's the mistress now, and and even though Belle's free, Belle chooses to stay at the end. So that also, and I do understand that historically that happened, that people chose to stay. I mean, because that's their family, that's what they know, and I guess that tie to the land or that tie to their families was stronger. I mean, that was Lavinia's family. That was everything she knew. But it was, how the racial, what could have, I don't even know how to put it to words, but it was striking. And Mary, you haven't said a word.
I know. I was about to say what we probably should wrap up this part of the discussion and switch over to Mary. So we can sort of pull back from the book for just a minute. I do want to say that there is a sequel. It's continuing the story of Jamie, and so the book is called. I can't think of it. I don't know the name of the book. I'm sorry, but it continues with Jamie going on into Philadelphia and passing as a wealthy white silversmith. So that's something you might want to take a look at if you're interested. But I do want to spend a little time and give Mary the opportunity. She has some information to share with us again about sort of the actual factual side of some of this, or the concepts. So Mary?
Yeah. Well, I was really enjoying listening to everyone's different perspectives and sort of feelings and the questions that they were having. And I was actually taking notes on some of the stuff that you all were talking about and how so many of the stories in the book I could connect to stories of individuals at Montpelier. So I had in my notes, the connection between with Martha, right, the mistress, and her isolation, and the fact that after James Madison dies, Dolly sells the plantation. First after he dies, she just leaves and goes to Washington, D.C. because she doesn't want to be in the middle of nowhere on a plantation isolated. And then eventually sells it. The connections between Marshall and Dolly's son, Payne, connections between the families and some of the enslaved families here at Montpelier. But I wanted to show you all a little bit. So I'm gonna share my screen with you all. So can you all see that? Yes, awesome, thank you. So because Wendy gave me the heads up that this was an international audience, some quick things is what and where is Montpelier? And we do say it Montpelier rather than Montpelier or any sort of proper French pronunciation. So to all of you in Canada, I apologize. Let's see. The map here is of Virginia. The filled in sort of goldish orange part is Orange County, which is where Montpelier is located. It's in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the Piedmont area of Virginia. We're about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of Washington, D.C., about an hour away from Richmond. The images that you see here, the top image is a photograph of pretty much what Montpelier looks like today. In the middle, that's James Madison, who was the 4th president of the United States. His wife, Dolly Madison, who we consider America's first lady. The other thing with James Madison is he was the primary architect of the Constitution. So he's kind of a big deal around these parts. The other two drawings there are historic drawings from the Madison period to give you an idea of what the place would have looked like during that time. And the one on the top right is a zoom in of a section of the drawing below it that shows an enslaved woman over near the temple structure. So, the enslaved community was certainly a part of Montpelier for over 6 generations. Madisons were only there for 3 generations, so that this really was a place, enslaved people were there 10 years before any Madison stepped foot on the property, and they were there an additional 20 years afterwards, and then some even after emancipation. This is an overhead of the plantation itself, and one of the things, the first thing as an archaeologist that I looked at when I started reading the book was the drawing in the beginning that showed sort of the layout of the plantation. So this kind of gives you an idea. Montpelier today has about 2,700 acres. At its height, it would have been about 5,000 acres. The main house is kind of up in the top right. The first star down from the house is where the domestic quarters for the enslaved community would have been. The next star that's very close to it are where the quarters for the sort of craftspeople, or sort of that middle area that I talked about, enslaved folks would have been. And then some of the field quarters are down at the bottom left, where that star is down there. And the star just above where it says Westgate Road is actually where one of the overseer's houses would have been, which is currently where we're doing our archaeological excavations and where Wendy's been out helping us wash artifacts. So you can see sort of the excavations of all these areas. And then what do these houses look like? So this is a architectural drawing of what the field quarters would have looked like, log cabin structures with wooden chimneys, all packed with clay. The houses for that sort of middle group would have been very similar, also log cabin structures with wooden chimneys. This one just happens to be a little bit larger and actually has two chimneys, one for cooking, a large hearth for cooking, and then one smaller hearth just for heating. And then the domestic quarters that are closest to the main house from that 18 teens, 1820s through the 1840s time period were timber frame structures on either brick piers or partial stone foundations. So there is certainly variation amongst the architecture between these different groups, but the biggest difference is not quality, it's who's designing them and why. So the timber frame structures where the domestic enslaved people lived were designed by Madison because he wanted them to look like English workers' housing. So they're like a total Monet. They look really, really nice from afar, but they're kind of a total mess. They would have been colder, they would have had less privacy, but they would have looked really nice from far away. While the log cabin structures would have been warmer, they would have had more opportunities for underground storage, a lot more privacy. And those are structures designed by enslaved people for enslaved people. So the needs and the wants are a little different. This is an overhead shot of what the reconstructions of those quarters by the main house are. So the two buildings, the rectangular white buildings are quarters for the domestic workers. They're double quarters. So it's almost like a duplex where each family would have had a room. And a family would have been anywhere from about 5 to about 15 people. So one of the things I did like about the book was how it showed that a typical enslaved family didn't always follow, in their living patterns, didn't always follow, you know, mom, dad, kid, sort of, but it was intergenerational, often included people like Lavinia that you're not related to but get placed with you. That was very, very common to have an enslaved person that was unrelated placed with another family. The building on the bottom left that looks like a log cabin is a reconstruction of what we call the stable quarter. So that quarter for the craftsmen folks. And then the two little square white buildings are reconstructed smokehouses. So Montpelier is unusual in that it had two smokehouses that were quite large. And this was because of the massive amount of entertaining they were doing here on the property. But to kind of give you an idea of what a smokehouse would look like. And when we're touring people around here, the smokehouses to me, I think, are always really powerful because the best possible interpretation for the enslaved community that's living right next door to them is you're living next to the best barbecue restaurant in the area, but you do not have access to any of that food. Smokehouses were kept locked, had very heavy doors, and the mistress of the plantation, so in this one, Dolly, would have kept the keys. So in order to get into the smokehouse, you actually had to check the key out from Dolly and then return it to her. So best case scenario, you are smelling meat that you aren't allowed to eat. Worst case scenario is that smokehouses, because they have these heavy locking doors and no windows, were often used as prisons or temporary jails for enslaved people. So if you can imagine the experience of your house being right next to one of those structures, even if it is not being used in such a way at Montpelier or on your plantation, you know what is happening on other plantations. It's incredibly common for enslaved people to not only travel, but to be married to people on other plantations, to have family members on other plantations nearby. I did want to talk a little bit about kitchens because so much of this book took place in kitchens and in a sort of a kitchen house or a kitchen quarter. We have quite a few different kitchens at Montpelier. In James Madison's second term of his presidency, so in the 18-teens, he starts expanding the house, and one of the things he does is he puts 2 kitchens in the cellars. So this is sort of what the one end of the kitchen would have looked like at the beginning of the restoration of the area. We did archaeology of the floors. They had been covered by concrete in the 20th century. Doing the archaeology, what you're seeing is the herringbone pattern of the bricks of the original kitchen floor. However, the bricks had been removed. So that is the imprint of the bricks that had still remained. This is the kitchen of one of the cellar kitchens after it was restored. You can see there's the large open hearth for cooking. There's also in the wall there an oven for baking bread, warming food. So kind of just general close-ups and setups of what a kitchen in the structure would have looked like. There also, Montpelier would have been several outdoor kitchens that were also quarters. One of which we have excavated and we are in the process of reconstructing right now. So the picture on the left, bottom left with the arc you see is part of the reconstruction of the hearth that just happened this past week. What you're seeing on the right is the excavations of the foundations of that building. And in the center is actually the top of the chimney, because when the building was taken down, the chimney collapsed and the entire top at one point broke off and sort of embedded itself as one whole unit in the ground. That's what the young woman in the front, the right-hand picture in the front bottom is pointing to. She's kind of squatting by it. That's that top of the chimney. And it matches, it has this plaster band around it that matches the plaster bands on the main house. But the other thing that is often left out of any sort of interpretation of a plantation kitchen, also this book, is that there were quarters with larger hearths that were designed in such a way in order to feed the enslaved community. So if you can imagine, much like the plantation in the book, at Montpelier, at any one time, you only have about 4 people living in this massive house. And you have about, at Montpelier, we would have 80 to about, at the max, about 110 enslaved people serving that main house, doing both the field labor, the other types of blacksmithing or distilling, other kind of skilled labor, and also the domestic work. But you know, you have to feed 100 people, and certainly the food that was cooked in the kitchens of the cellars or even in the kitchen quarter I just showed you would have not gone to the enslaved community. So instead, they would have had to build some of their structures with larger hearths. So these 2 chimneys in the center are the chimneys of those 2 reconstructed double quarters. And what you can see is the bottom one is quite large and the top one is quite a bit smaller. And what we found, and that is completely based off what we found by digging in the ground, we found one really big hearth and one that was quite a bit smaller, which indicates that there was probably communal kitchen or communal cooking going on in the one with the large hearth to feed the enslaved domestic workers that were living in these buildings, you know, kind of all together sort of communally. And the picture on the right is a woman named Lenny Sorensen. She's a culinary historian. This is, she was giving a talk that you can watch. They've all been recorded. The links below, go to them. So if you go to OCAAHSJuneteenth.org, she filmed a bunch of videos talking about the kitchens and cooks and what being an enslaved cook would be like. So she's sitting in front of that larger hearth that would have been used for cooking. And then also the, what we call the stable quarter, so this log cabin structure with the 2 chimneys, one was quite large again for cooking. So I think it's really important to think about how this labor of feeding your fellow enslaved community members was not something that was often recognized by the Madisons or any of the plantation owners. It was sort of an afterthought, and it's often an afterthought to interpretation today. we're often focused very much on how the food's going into the main house, but not how the food is being prepared or served for the enslaved community. And so often that work was on older women. They, you know, sometimes you'll hear about an enslaved woman being retired, but her retirement would be to cook and prepare all the meals for all the other enslaved people while also watching all of the children that were too young to work. And that is a lot of work. That is not retirement to me. Meals sort of in the main house. I wanted to kind of include this. So this center picture is a picture of what the inside of the dining room at Montpelier looks like today. These sort of, the picture of, that's James on the left, Dolly at the head of the table. The typical dishes that they would have had, all of those are there because that is what we had found archaeologically in the ground. This table in the center with no tablecloth is set for a dessert service, while the one on the bottom left is set for more of a formal dinner service. The meals for the enslaved community, this is something that we actually do quite a bit at Montpelier. The gentleman in the center picture here is Michael Twitty. He is an award-winning author, James Beard Award-winning for his writing about food and African-American foodways. He has come and cooked for us in our property. On the left there is Lenny preparing some hoe cakes. And then on the top right is a gentleman by the name of Jerome Bias, who is a food historian from North Carolina who cooks for us as well. I also wanted to make sure that we talked about the names of the enslaved people who did the cooking at Montpelier, because so often I'll drop James and Dolly, but I think it's really important to recognize the names of the enslaved as well. So there are several women that we know worked as cooks or at some point during their life worked as cooks for the Madisons. Aisley Payne is one that we know at Montpelier, Katie Taylor, as well as Ellen Stewart White. Both we know at some points worked as cooks for the Madisons in Washington, D.C. And Corinne is another one who we're going to talk about sort of specifically. But what you're seeing here is actually a still from a video that we play at Montpelier. That is the story about Ellen Stewart. And has the names of the folks that were enslaved at the time of 1844, which is when the property was sold. But Corinne is an interesting person to understand in history, and we know about her through the woman pictured in this picture. This woman is Dr. Betty Kearse. Betty is a descendant of Corinne and another enslaved woman by the name of Mandy, and Betty has just come out with this book called The Other Madisons. It came out during COVID, so it's a very recent publication where she traces her family's oral history of being direct descendants from James Madison Sr. and James Madison Jr., who was the president. And she serves as her family griot, sort of the story keeper. In their family, they have sort of the family motto is sort of always remember that you were a Madison. And the story is that her Mandy was raped by James Madison Sr. and had a daughter named Corinne. And Corinne worked as an enslaved cook and then was raped by her half-brother, James Madison Jr., producing a line of enslaved people that can be traced to Dr. Kearse. And she goes through her whole journey of sort of how do I discover, connections to this family story through everything from DNA to historical genealogical research. And it's a really amazing book kind of telling her story. And one of the things that connects to her story is this ring. This ring was found during our excavations of the kitchen quarter that we are currently reconstructing. We found this ring in 2016. It's a finger ring. I wear about a size 5 and it fits perfectly on my finger to kind of give you an idea. It is made of a material called carnelian, and carnelian is a stone that is native to the Middle East and to South Asia, so India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. It is an incredibly rare find in the Americas. Archaeologically, I've been doing archaeology for over 18 years and never once had seen this material come up on an archaeological site. The only one on our staff who had was our director, Dr. Matt Reeves, who saw one bead one time in a burial of an enslaved person of African heritage in Jamaica over 30 years ago. So this ring is incredibly rare. When carnelian is found archaeologically in the Caribbean and in North America, it is almost exclusively found with people of African descent. It is almost exclusively found in burials and usually in the form of beads. So we found it in the kitchen. And that was really kind of a shock. When we found it, we even went as far to have it analyzed for hardness to verify that it wasn't an imposter material because it was such a rare find. But it all started to fall into place. We looked at other archaeological sites where rings had also been found in kitchens, which seems to make sense. So many of us take our rings off when we're in the kitchen to keep them safe, and then we lose them when we set them on a windowsill or next to the sink. So the behavior seemed to line up. And also sort of the connection to this ring to people of African descent. Certainly this was not only a workspace, but a living space for African Americans. But what we really started to figure out is that this material and these objects were not traded or brought or sold into North America. And when they do appear in these contexts, it's because they came on the bodies of enslaved people when they were taken from Africa. So we think this is the only object in our over 3 million object collection that actually came from Africa, that it would have been on an enslaved woman's body when she was taken, when she was brought to Montpelier in the early 1700s, and then passed down through her family when it was eventually lost in the early 1800s, most likely by an enslaved woman working in the kitchen. And it was such a sort of powerful story, but we always want more evidence. So we started talking to Betty and many other members of the enslaved descendant community. And when we started telling her that we thought that this ring might have originated in Africa, she went, oh my gosh, in my family, we have an oral history of a red bead that came over from Africa and was passed down in the same way that you think that this ring may have been. So that similarity in that story just gave it so much more weight to us. So we are hoping that when the reconstruction of the kitchen is completed, we can actually return this ring to be on exhibit there to kind of have it in its appropriate home. One thing I do want to say, and I see some of you guys put some things in the chat, but before we kind of go into that, some other questions is, what Wendy is doing right now is she is spending a week with us at Montpelier, and she's helping me do a lot of lab work, but we have programs where you can come and dig with us and rebuild structures with us and work in the lab with us and help us with exhibits and designs and all sorts of things. And it is one of the most exciting things that we do. We have housing on the property. We have people that have been coming for over 26 years to come on these programs. We have the woman in the center there is Maureen. She is 90 years old. Anyone can do it. If you don't want to dig, you can always work with us in the lab like Wendy has with me. And you might notice in the bottom right picture, that's the back of Wendy's head at a program she came on with me that was all themed around the archaeology of dining. So we were actually having a historic happy hour and tasting at that point. She's holding a tray full of cookies baked off of a recipe from a cookbook that the Madisons owned. So I am going to stop sharing my screen right now. So I can see if there's any, okay, so how, the bottom question, we start at the bottom and go up. How long did it take her to research the book? Are you asking, is that about Betty's book? Is that, or is that about the
Yeah, I think that might be about the Kitchen House book.
The Kitchen House book?
Yeah. We want
okay, great. Does anybody have any questions for me about anything I showed you, or any things that the book where you really want to go, like, is this really a thing? Do people really do this? One thing I will say is that plantations vary not only plantation to plantation, but region and in time. We have such, so often our understanding of plantation life is really situated in Mississippi and Louisiana in the 1860s. We think of big cotton plantations, kind of gone with the wind style, but there is a real difference in architecture, in style, depending on the time period and the location. And one thing that I think is important is whenever you see something at a plantation that looks really nice, like if you look at a house and you think, oh, well, that porter looks very nice, or, oh, look how pretty their dishes are, I encourage you to think critically about how does that benefit the enslaver to have that enslaved person have that thing. So one of the ways I would suggest to do this is a way that it would benefit the Madisons to have the enslaved community live in sort of single family homes is that in 1808, the international slave trade is outlawed. And following that is the cotton boom in the Deep South. And plantation owners all over Virginia and Maryland start selling enslaved people down south. And because they can make more money doing that than they can raising any crop or any other type of production. James Madison himself sells 16 people to Louisiana at one fell swoop. And this is incredibly common, that they are actually encouraging enslaved people to get married and to have babies because that babies is profitable to them. People are often shocked that the enslaved people have beautiful dishes that are highly decorated. But that's because they had to buy them themselves, and the Madisons are not chipping things and passing it down. It benefits James Madison if he doesn't have to provide dishes for people. So anytime we think about things that even many of the enslaved people at Montpelier were able to read and write, but again, that benefited James Madison because he in his office alone had thousands of books, and he wasn't going to walk up and down the stairs to get them, particularly in his old age when he was an invalid, and he needed his enslaved workers to be able to go and get him the right books. So everything that is a freedom or a privilege could be taken away the moment it stopped serving the enslaver. And so I think that's always a really important thing to think about, because I think there's a tendency often when people go to these historic sites and see that they're beautiful and to go, I can't tell you how many times I hear, well, this isn't so bad. Look at their plates. It's not so bad. But when you start to spin it of thinking of why is this good for the person that's holding this individual in bondage, it will start to change your looking. So I see from Lisa, did the Madisons free any of their slaves? No. The Madisons did not free any of their slaves. At one point, James sells a young man by the name of Billy Gardner into slavery in Pennsylvania, because by that point, Billy has been with him in Philadelphia and has been around so many free people of color. Madison describes him as being tainted by liberty, and that he can't possibly bring him back to the plantation because he'll sort of infect everyone else with these ideas of freedom, which is a little ironic coming from James Madison. And so instead of freeing him, he sells him into slavery in Pennsylvania, because after, by that point, Pennsylvania had changed their laws saying if you got sold in slavery, you had to serve 7 years and then you could be freed. Other than that, at one point, Paul Jennings asks Dolly if he can buy his own freedom. She says no. She eventually sells him to someone else where he is able to purchase his freedom. Other enslaved people run away and get their freedom either by running away or getting abolitionists to sponsor them after that they have run away to purchase their freedom, including Ellen Stewart. How much of our archaeological plan has been completed at Montpelier? Oh, geez. I would say less than 20% of the 2,700 acres has been surveyed. So all the archaeological sites just found. And of that fully excavated, I mean, we're looking at 5% or less. So we have many, many, many years of work left to do. And then I see. So was opium used by men on plantations? In the book, they only mention women. That's a really good question that I don't 100% know the answer to. Opium was certainly used by a lot of people, not only on plantations, but kind of everywhere. Because it was in everything. If you ever hear of things called patent medicines, they're basically just opium, alcohol, and whatever food coloring or other things that they threw in there. So it would not have been unusual for men to use it. Payne Todd, who was Dolly's son, himself had mental health problems, similar in some ways to Marshall, a little less anger issues, a little bit more sort of melancholy, addiction issues like alcohol and gambling. So certainly those things would have been available to both men and women, and abused by both. Let's see. Anybody else have questions?
So once slavery was abolished, then what happened to all of these people? Were they allowed to go?
Yes, they were allowed. So one thing that we have seen at Montpelier is there was a gentleman by the name of George Gilmore that was enslaved at Montpelier, who eventually purchases a little over a dozen acres of the Montpelier estate and builds his family house that they live in into the 20th century, a cabin that we've since interpreted. So he stayed in the area and then continued to work at Montpelier, but for pay. Many, many, many enslaved people left. And even before the end of the Civil War. So you may have heard the term contraband, but basically that was a name given to enslaved people who ran away to Union forts. And what Congress did, they passed the First and Second Confiscation Acts during the Civil War that used the South's argument that enslaved people were property, not people, against them by saying, okay, well then we can treat them as any other contraband of war and we don't have to give them back to you, and that overrides the Fugitive Slave Act. So people start self-emancipating en masse at the outbreak of the Civil War. And you see this a lot around DC, but any of the borderlands and anywhere that there was a Union stronghold. So you see this in Louisiana and in Mississippi as well. Following the war, what you also see in the newspapers are thousands and thousands of personal ads being taken out by enslaved people trying to reunite with their families. So enslaved people that have been sold and separated, putting out ads with physical descriptions of family members that they're looking for, the last place that person may have been seen or who their owner had been. So there's this massive effort following the war of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, to reunite with their families into places that were safe and provided opportunities. So a lot of enslaved people are moving to cities from the country for financial and economic opportunities and to reconnect. I see another question. So did any of Madison's slaves run away? Yes, several did. One of the most famous ones is Ellen Stewart. She was enslaved and brought after James Madison's death to Washington, D.C. by Dolly. And while she is there, she makes an attempt to run away on a boat called the Pearl, which was a pretty famous attempt. So basically, this schooner was supposed to take enslaved people out of Alexandria and DC to freedom, and the boat was caught, and all of the enslaved people were jailed. But the Northern abolitionist newspapers really caught this story, and it became sort of the cause du jour of abolitionists at the time. So this is in the 1830s, 1840s time period. And abolitionists basically fundraised and purchased the freedom of the people that had all been on the Pearl. and they used sort of particularly the stories of women as a way to motivate abolitionists, that good Christian enslaved women were going to get sold to Louisiana as part of what was called the fancy girl trade or the sex trade, and that it was the duty of Christian white abolitionists to step in and save them. So Ellen Stewart was one of these people on the Pearl that got her freedom through a failed attempt to run away, but eventually that led to her freedom being purchased. So was it common for slaves to move from artisan slave or artisan to domestic? Yeah, I think it was pretty common. If you were a really highly skilled blacksmith or something along those lines, that might be your career forever. But the business of the plantation often changed by the whims of the owners. So I can give you an example. Spinning cloth is something that sometimes happened on the plantation and sometimes didn't. And it all depended on what the market was, when it was cheaper to make your own fabric versus buy it. Same with blacksmithing. When was it cheaper to make your own nails versus buy them? So you could be highly skilled, and then your labor in some ways becomes more expensive because the raw materials are more expensive. And then you could shift into another job. So that it's not unheard of for people's jobs to be shifted around. Although many of those positions, particularly the highly skilled positions, people are trained from a very young age to do them. So, any other questions?
Yeah, how do we reach you?
Any of you all can always email me. I'll put it in the chat. But I'll also say it. So my email is mfminkoff at montpelier.org. So if you can't remember that or how to spell it, you can always email dig@montpelier.org. That goes to the archaeology department, and they can get things to me through dig. We are also very active on social media. We have a Montpelier Archaeology Facebook page. We have a really active Instagram. We are all over the social medias. So if you are bored and looking for new people to follow, please follow us. We also have a newsletter that we'll send out about once a month. If you're interested in learning about our programs or our latest finds, kind of cool things that are coming out of the ground.
And one thing I would say about Montpelier that I've always really thought was very important is that they look at the importance of all the people that work there. It's not, this is a place that James and Dolly Madison lived. This is the entire community that lived and worked at this property. And so there's the respect and the detail that's been given to the enslaved community is really, really well felt at Montpelier, more than many, many places I've been to. So.
That's amazing. I feel like we could go on for an hour. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to, we've gone a little over time, but if there are other questions, maybe what I could suggest is send them to me, and maybe we can do an interview with you, Mary, and get some more questions in an article instead, and then we can use some of your other content. That would be great. And I just want to mention our next book club is in a month, and we're doing Travels with My Hat. And as I mentioned in the chat, we would like to make speakers going forward, and to whatever they may choose. But if you'd like to help us with that, I put a link in the chat for you to make a donation, and it's basically buying a cup of coffee, which would be helpful. And I also want to mention we have community calls every week in the Eastern time zone that we would love you to join. They happen on Fridays. And then we've just started on the West Coast, which is once a month on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And we also have a call now in Indonesia and Australia. So we're trying to bring in more people to these conversations. So again, Mary, thank you so much. Thank you everyone else for attending. Yay. And thank you, Wendy, for pulling this all together, doing it from the backseat of your car on the road. I love it. That's a nerd. Okay. Have a nice night, everybody. Thank you.
All right. See you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you.